Today we're going to begin some watercolor practice. So you will need a sheet of watercolor paper or a couple of sheets. You need enough room for 21 different techniques. I am using a sheet of watercolor paper that is 12 by 18, so I'm going to be able to fit all of my 21 techniques onto here. I just need to divide this piece of paper up. If you have paper that is smaller, you'll want to evenly measure out 21 spaces between a couple of sheets of paper. So starting with my 12 by 18 paper in portrait view, I'm just going to simply divide this up into 3 parts. And you can see here I was already planning out my measurements. So at the bottom of my paper with the 0 along the left edge, I'm going to make a mark at 4 inches and a mark at 8 inches. And if you remember from previous videos, we don't want to turn our paper. We want to slide our ruler to the top. Once again, with the 0 lined up to the left edge, I want to again make a mark at 4 and at 8. Now since this is a long sheet of paper and I only have a 12-inch ruler, I'm also going to make those marks in the middle of my paper. So moving my ruler down to the middle, I am going to line up with the 0 on the left edge and once again mark at 4 and at 8. And now that I have those marks, I'm going to use my straight edge to draw my lines to divide up my paper. So now I have 3 sections. I'm going to turn my paper into landscape view, and I now need to divide it up into 7 sections. So once again, I was prepping ahead. So if you are using paper that you received off of me, yours will also be 12 by 18. And we're going to make some measurements. Now, if you have troubles determining 1/16 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch, as long as you are close to about 2.5 inches in size, you will have a fairly even distribution of boxes for our techniques. Starting at the bottom of my paper with my 0 lined up to the left edge, I'm going to make a mark at 2 9/16. It's the 1/16 inch line past the 2.5 inch mark. I'm making a mark at 5 1/8, 1 at 7 11/16, and 1 at 10 1/4. Now since I only have a 12-inch ruler, I don't have enough room here for another 2 9/16 added on to 10 1/4. So I'm going to move my ruler, line up my 0 on that 10 1/4 inch mark that I last made, and repeat my first 2 numbers. So once again, I make a mark at 2 9/16 and 5 1/8. As we already discussed, I'm not going to turn my paper. I'm going to instead move my ruler to the top and once again make those same measurements at the top of my paper. So once again, with 0 lined up to the left edge, I'm making a mark at 2 9/16, a mark at 5 1/8, a mark at 7 11/16, and a mark at 10 1/4. I will once again need to move my ruler over. Line up the 0 to my 10 1/4 inch mark and repeat my first 2 measurements, 2 9/16 and 5 1/8. Now that I have those marks at top and bottom, I'm going to once again use my straight edge, line those marks up, and draw my lines. So this will give me 21 spaces to practice 21 watercolor techniques, and they are fairly evenly distributed. Again, if you have smaller paper, you'll probably want at least 2 sheets to divide up evenly so that you have room to practice 21 watercolor techniques. My next step to this is I'm now going to just again use my straight edge, but now use a Sharpie marker to trace over my pencil lines to make them permanent.
Now that we have our watercolor paper divided into our 21 sections, whether that is on one sheet of paper or divided up among a couple of sheets of paper, we want to now label the techniques that we are going to use. So I'm going to use a Sharpie marker again. It's important that when you both trace the lines and write these terms down, that you use a permanent marker. Since we are working with watercolor, anything that is not a permanent marker could reactivate with water and cause some bleeding on your paper. So starting at the top, I'm going to label this one as a solid wash. Beside it, a graded wash. And the last box on the top, I'm going to label it as glazing. On the next row, below solid wash, I'm going to label this one wet on wet. Beside it, drop color on wet color. And the last one of this row will be dry brush. On the next row down, below wet on wet, I'm going to label it scumbling. Beside scumbling will be negative painting. And beside negative painting will be lift or feather out. Moving down, underneath scumbling will be pushing out pigment. Beside that will be wipe out. And we'll either be using a brush or Kleenex. We'll try both. And the last one for this row will be detail painting. Moving on to my next row, below pushing out pigment, I'm going to label this one as masking fluid or tape. Beside this one will be hard and soft edge. And last in this row will be scratching, wet, dry. Below masking fluid, I'm going to label this one as magic eraser. Beside it, salt. And beside salt, we're going to put water splatter, and blooms. For my last set of boxes, I'm going to write sandpaper and watercolor pencil. In the middle is sponge. And the very last box will be opaque versus transparent. So these are our 21 techniques. So you want to make sure you get your paper or pages labeled so that when we begin our practices, you know what area we'll be working in. There is one other technique that I think we should cover, and it's one you probably remember from elementary school. And since I am out of room on my large sheet of paper, I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to divide detail painting in half. And for this, I'm just going to do it by sight and not measure that halfway.
And I'm just going to divide it with a line in half. And underneath detail painting here, I'm going to write the word resist. And that'll be another technique we talk about.